John D. Kasarda, Jack to his friends and colleagues, graduated from Cornell in 1967 with a bachelor's degree in economics and then earned an MBA there the next year. He completed his PhD in sociology at Chapel Hill in 1971. Jack taught sociology for 3 years at the University of Chicago, then for 2 more years at Florida Atlantic University, before returning to the University of North Carolina in 1976, where he has been for almost 40 years. Until 1990, he was in the sociology department there, but later moved to the business school to become the director of the Kennan Institute of Private Enterprise. Although he started out as a sociologist and demographer, he has reinvented himself in the last 20 years and is now primarily recognized as an advisor to business and the author of the idea of the aerotropolis, viewing airports as the new decisive factor in the growth and competitiveness of cities. This article, written in 1989, just before he shifted from sociology to the business school, is one of the landmark early studies of the evolution of the new problem of a mismatch between where people live and where their jobs are located. His analysis of metropolitan change in both residential and employment patterns during the 1970s captures the early stages of what has become a continuing serious problem for cities and their residents in the United States. The point for Jack Kasarda's article centers on a serious new social problem that was emerging in late 20th century American cities. He describes the dynamic process that has been described by many scholars from the first half of the century, including Adna Weber, Ernest Burgess, Lewis Worth, and others, the process Burgess called invasion and succession. Each new ethnic minority arriving in American cities settled first in the challenging environment of the inner zone in transition, and then moved outward as they were assimilated into the economy and the society, and as the city continued to expand and deconcentrate. But by the middle of the 20th century, something appeared to have broken down for this social and economic conveyor belt. The black population that moved to cities as part of the Great Migration seemed to have gotten stuck in an urban dead end of substandard housing, impoverished and violent neighborhoods, massive unemployment, in particular for young men, and proliferation of single parenthood for women. All these problems seemed to be interrelated, but scholars were having trouble figuring out what had led to this dead-end situation. Kasarda turned to research from the urban ecology tradition in his search for an answer. In the final quarter of the 20th century, as the United States settled solidly into the status of an urban society with a large majority of the entire population living in cities, research began to proliferate into the various social and economic consequences of the dominant trend of that period, urban deconcentration into what Kasarda himself famously called low-density urban regions, rather than just talking about cities in the traditional sense. In this article, he looks beyond the fact that people were sorting themselves out into a residential mosaic segregated by ethnicity, social class, and other factors such as stage of the life cycle, as documented in other studies we have seen. To this picture of residential sorting out, he adds a new second dimension concerned not with where people live, but where they work. His study is an early contribution to what has become known as the mismatch literature, referring to a mismatch between where people live and where they work. The problem has been described as an urban dumbbell, with your residence at one end, your place of employment on the other, and a lot of traveling back and forth every day between these places. If we consider the time that contemporary Americans spend just commuting back and forth, and the unbelievable total lifetime distances that they cover while doing so, we would quickly realize that nothing like this has ever happened anywhere else on the planet before, and that possibly it never will again. It is a truly strange situation, and only being caught up inside of it keeps us from recognizing this immediately. Kasarda examines some of the unintended consequences of urban deconcentration and of the emergence of the urban dumbbell, increasing the distance between work and home. His thesis is that the dead-end situation of poor black inner-city neighborhoods can be traced back to these larger ecological processes. Concentrating on the employment side of the balance rather than residential patterns, he specifies 2 separate trends that contributed to the emerging problem. First, he points out that jobs suitable for inner-city residents of the zone in transition have been disappearing faster and faster as the 20th century went on. The earlier waves of immigrants counted on an expanding job base rooted in the great manufacturing districts of cities like Pittsburgh or Detroit, connected to the industrial giants like U.S. Steel, General Electric, and automobile manufacturers like Ford and General Motors. These jobs, providing the economic foundation for everything else about making a new life in America's cities, were vanishing as part of a long-term shift in the underlying structure of the U.S. labor force. To see this shift in historical perspective, we can look at how the occupations of men changed over the 20th century. Occupational figures for women are misleading because the women married to farmers were not counted as farming early in the century, even though their husbands were counted. For men, we can see not only the disappearance of farmers, but also a large decline in ordinary laborers that went on for the whole century. The blue-collar manufacturing and craftsman jobs actually expanded during the first half of the century, up to the high point of manufacturing in the United States around 1960. But in the second half of the century, these blue-collar jobs also began to disappear. The share of men working in professional, technical, and managerial occupations has increased faster and faster as the jobs on which earlier generations of immigrants depended when they first arrived in America's cities have been vanishing from the economy. If this were the only thing that had been happening to jobs available to relatively unskilled, uneducated workers newly arrived in our cities, that would be bad enough. But Kasarda cites a substantial body of research that already had been assembled at that time, showing that not only were people moving out to new residences further and further from the center of the city, but jobs also were beginning to follow them out of the city center. It was the double whammy of these two trends, both the gradual disappearance of jobs for less educated, less skilled workers from the entire economy, and the relocation of jobs out of the central cities that Kasarda believes combined to trap the people arriving from the rural South in their dead-end situation as it materialized in U.S. cities toward the end of the century. To document this argument, he examined occupational data from U.S. census counts in 1970 and 1980. His focus on this decade allowed him to capture in full swing the emptying out of certain kind of jobs from America's central cities. He selects several of the largest, most important metropolitan areas of the country and then separates the occupational figures for the central cities from those for the suburbs. The tables in Kasarda's article present employment statistics for many different cities around the United States. The basic trend during the 1970s was very similar in all of them, so we will just pick out Philadelphia as an example and consider his findings in detail. In this part of the lecture, we will concentrate on what was going on during that decade in the central city, and then in the final part of the lecture, we will turn to what he discovered about the suburbs. First of all, if we look at the figures for different occupational categories, we can see that certain occupations experienced a dramatic exodus during the decade. New jobs are continually being created in the economy of every city, but the net trend in the balance of new jobs created versus existing jobs lost is what counts in the end. In these net terms, over 75,000 blue-collar jobs disappeared from the economy of downtown Philadelphia in just 10 years, along with another 50,000 or so clerical and sales jobs. The trend was very much the same in city after city from Kasarda's tables. These are precisely the kind of jobs that once helped to power the conveyor belt of assimilation and social and geographic upward mobility in America's cities. These blue-collar and sales jobs were the primary occupational niches available to people with only modest educations and not many specialized job skills. After the Great Migration out of the South, the first new generation of the migrants' children born in the city, people who might have started moving up and out of the zone in transition in earlier decades, saw their economic foundations pulled out from under their feet. Unemployment rates started to rise, and Kasarda says this was a key factor in the whole chain of unfortunate consequences that followed, leading to the present dead-end situation. Another way of looking at this same pattern, rather than by occupations, would be to classify jobs in Central City, Philadelphia, in both censuses, according to the normal educational qualifications required for each of them. By this alternative measure, we see that job losses were even more sharply concentrated in fields that would be available to young men and women who failed to finish high school. Over 144,000 such low-skilled jobs that existed in Philadelphia in 1970 had disappeared 10 years later. At the same time, though, both this figure classifying jobs by education and the previous one grouping them by occupations also show that in some categories, central Philadelphia actually continued to gain more new jobs than it lost during this critical decade. The central city added many thousands of new professional, technical, and managerial jobs, most of which required advanced education to qualify for them. In fact, some of the clerical and sales jobs must also have added some college requirements because there were more new jobs added downtown in the top two educational categories than in the top two occupational categories from the previous figure. These new higher-paying, higher-skilled jobs represent the other side of the coin from the vanishing unskilled blue-collar jobs. Both trends are the result in part of the shifting occupational structure in the national labor market as a whole. The problem was, of course, that most of the people who got these new jobs were not the residents of Central City, Philadelphia. Most of them went to more educated commuters from the suburbs, as problems getting into the city center in the morning and getting out again in the evening grew worse and worse during this and following decades. Many of the people who moved to the suburbs or already lived there found themselves handling the urban dumbbell and commuting back and forth long distances between homes and jobs. Obviously, this did nothing very helpful for the people still living in the central city. Many of the central city residents did not qualify for these new jobs. They often lacked the education and special skills required even to apply for them. More people in the central city were unable to find jobs, and at the same time, many of the new jobs created in these central cities could not be filled by people living there. The growing mismatch between jobs and residences of people, produced in part by urban deconcentration and sorting out, and in part by trends inside the labor force itself, increased the flow of commuters instead. If only the central city residents had been qualified for the new jobs that appeared there, replacing the unskilled jobs that were disappearing, much of the resulting social and economic turmoil might have been avoided. But Kasarda documents the other kind of mismatch that also existed and that guaranteed that the problems would grow. He presents figures for the educational backgrounds of all job holders in the city and contrasts those backgrounds with the educational profile of black men in the central city who had no jobs. Of those men without jobs, almost 2/3 had dropped out of high school, but less than 1/4 of all the available jobs were available to someone without a high school diploma. Almost half, about 40% of all jobs in the city, required at least some college education, and in most cases a college degree. But only about 10% of the unemployed central city men had attended any college at all. This is not a mismatch of job location versus residential location. It is a mismatch of job requirements versus educational attainment. We should remember that the educational attainment was never much different than this for previous groups of new arrivals in the city who took their turns earlier living in the zone in transition. What changed in the late 20th century was not the character of the successive population groups entering the city on the economic ground floor, but the economic context of the jobs available to these new arrivals in their inner city locations. Kasarda makes a reasonable case that the doubled effects of structural change in the labor force and relocation of jobs out into the expanding outer zones of the city cut the ground out from under the people who happened to be living in the central city later in the century. But we don't see the same picture of reinforcing trends and a resulting employment crisis when we look outward to the suburbs. The situation in the 1970s looked very different in the suburbs of the metro area studied by Kasarda compared to what he found in the central cities. Of central cities, suburbs also added many new white-collar jobs. In fact, about twice as many such new jobs appeared in the suburbs as in the central city. The difference in the suburbs was that the people who qualified for these jobs also were living in adjacent residential neighborhoods. Used to seeing office parks, hotels, retail outlets, and other commercial development appear wherever the ring freeway around a city meets one of the major spoke freeways leading out of the center and away toward other cities. But 3 decades ago, the appearance of these new clusters of white-collar employment were something new that many scholars remarked about. A few years after Kasarda's article, the journalist Joel Garrow coined the term edge city to describe these places, and used it as the title of his widely read book. An edge city is a new cluster of business and retail development, together with some related residential buildings such as condominium towers, that appears at one of these ring and spoke junctions in the outer zones of a city. Garrow suggested minimum square feet of retail commercial space to qualify a place as an edge city, but even without specific criteria, most of us have no trouble recognizing places like Tyson's Corner, Virginia, on the outskirts of Washington, D.C., as one of these new clusters. Probably you are familiar with other examples. Edge cities are just one illustration of the contrasting employment trends that Kasarda is talking about. As cities deconcentrated and sorted themselves out into different types of residential neighborhoods, employers followed the people outward, shifting many jobs out into the suburban ring. If a suburban resident organizes things effectively today, it may be possible to live 10 or 20 miles outside the center of a major American city and spend many years going to work, shopping in large upscale retail outlets, dining in restaurants, going to the movies and sporting events, visiting parks, libraries, and other civic amenities, and never even go near the center of the city at all. When jobs follow people to the suburbs, the spreading out and sorting out process becomes self-sustaining. This expansion of good jobs was not the biggest contrast between suburbs and central cities, though. After all, high-skilled jobs requiring more education also multiplied in most central cities, though many of the residents there could not qualify for them. The real contrast came in the form of tens of thousands of additional blue-collar, clerical, and sales jobs added in the suburbs of Philadelphia and other cities. All categories of occupations actually increased for the suburbs during the decade, including establishment of new suburban manufacturing plants and new retail outlets in need of sales staff and clerical workers. The figures for Philadelphia's suburbs from Kasarda's tables, as for many other cities, did show slower growth of jobs requiring less education and faster growth for professions and managerial positions. But the gains in blue-collar jobs in suburbs form a sharp contrast with the huge blue-collar job losses in central cities. Many of these positions were simply relocating further out from the center of the metro area. As Kasarda says, the jobs were following the outward movement of the population. Some less educated central city residents probably were able to keep such jobs that were moving out to the suburbs. People familiar with morning rush hour in large cities know that while one stream of traffic carries suburban residents into the city to work in the office high-rises there, a counter stream is usually moving outward from the city towards some of these suburban jobs. A University of Chicago professor used to take his graduate students out to a freeway overpass early in the morning, face them south, and have them look down on the traffic heading north into the central loop area. He would ask them what they saw. They generally replied that they saw a lot of middle-aged white men wearing suits and ties, driving alone in their cars to work in the city. Then he would have them cross the overpass and look down into the southbound cars on the opposite side of the freeway. Again, he would ask them what they saw. This time they would report seeing a lot of minority drivers, both male and female, hardly any of them wearing suits and ties, heading out of the city to work at manufacturing and other jobs that had relocated outside of the central city. He assured them that if they came back for the evening rush hour, they would see all of the same people again, each group rushing back the way they had come in the morning. At least one student would always exclaim about what a waste it all seemed to be and suggest that people should just figure out a way to live closer to where they work. But the dynamics of contemporary cities guarantees that many or most of the less educated, less skilled workers in central cities are not able to follow the jobs when they move to the suburbs. They don't have enough money to afford a car, insurance, taxes, gasoline, parking, and all the other expenses required by the urban dumbbell that generates mass commuting in private automobiles. So while some fraction of central city workers can still find jobs, even if it means commuting to the suburbs or even beyond every day, most are simply left behind in neighborhoods that deteriorate because the paychecks to support it have disappeared in such large numbers. Having sketched out his structural explanation for the problems of the inner city, Kasarda turns in his final pages to questions of what solutions remain. He holds out no hope that the central city residents might be able to follow everybody else out to the suburbs, to the edges of the city, and join in the economic growth shown in the graph above. If they can't afford cars to get to suburban jobs, how can they hope to afford the suburban houses and lots that might enable them to move there? Instead, he explores some other suggestions that were being made in those years about the predicament of inner-city residents. Earlier in the article, he mentioned some national policy initiatives promoted at the time, some like jobs programs and other government benefits promoted by liberals, and others like tax breaks and various kinds of deregulation proposed by conservatives. Neither type of program, he concluded, had been able to do anything about the dead-end central city situation because none of them addressed the fundamental problem of the two kinds of mismatch: the mismatch between jobs and residences and the mismatch between jobs and qualifications of people living near the job locations. He speculates about whether inner-city residents might follow the model of some even more recent immigrant groups who seem to have met the challenges of the difficult employment situation by becoming self-employed entrepreneurs. He paid special attention to groups like Cubans and some Asian communities who had managed to generate businesses and create their own jobs for themselves. But he concludes that such entrepreneurship demands a level of community resources and solidarity that simply was not available to other groups. For example, the Cubans in Miami not only brought a lot of capital with them when they fled Cuba, but they also received massive federal subsidies and support as refugees from communism. Kasarda shows the very low levels of self-employed entrepreneurs among Black and Hispanic dropouts, linking these low levels to a lack of economic resources in the community to sustain new businesses, and also to a lack of community solidarity to get behind such efforts. Similar evaluations have been made in the years since Kasarda's article came out by Elijah Anderson and other more recent writers. But one trend that could make a significant contribution to the problem might be mentioned as we wrap up this consideration of Kasarda's study done so many years ago. In the intervening years, there's been a tremendous shift in the educational attainment of the Black population in the United States. The large proportion of high school dropouts that Kasarda shows for unemployed Black men in central cities is actually similarly high for the entire Black population 30 years ago. However, over 3/4 of all Black men in the United States today have completed high school, and a rising number are attending college. These more educated workers can qualify for some of the new professional, managerial, and white-collar jobs that continue to increase in central cities, opening at least one avenue toward a solution of the dead-end central city problem. But decades of a reinforcing cycle of poverty and social problems also have led to a stubbornly persistent problem with higher than average dropout rates in inner city schools, a problem that partially closes this education route out of the problem. A number of the other articles still ahead of us for the course continue this concern with the challenging social realities created in the core of major U.S. cities by the process of spatial deconcentration and segregation by both social class and ethnicity.